I've, for the majority of my time, I've been very idealistic, just like yourself.
I actually don't super appreciate being called idealistic because it sounds naive.
I believe you are. At the end of the day, we all have to be somewhat subversive to our opponent.
Why do you need to be subversive to have a counter argument?
By subversive here, we mean basically to undercut their argument.
Maybe I'm wrong. That's been intentionally subversive, which I just didn't expect. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Humanizing. Today I have Arch, formerly Arch Warhammer, now just Arch YouTube, which I'm sure we'll get into why that is the case. As always with the Humanizing show, the point of the show is to understand why somebody thinks what they think. This isn't going to be some epic debate bro show. There are other things you can watch of mine if you want debates. What is interesting to me here is not so much to go through and do PR to say everyone is nice and kind and we should love everyone. The actual question is, what makes other people tick and think? And usually when you get into that, everyone feels a whole lot more relatable. My goal is that if people ever look into drama or things that pop off or are controversial about the controversial humanizing figures that I bring on, that essentially you can use this to understand the controversy a little bit better. It is not to excuse or anything like that. And as always, the opinions that are espoused by my guest are not necessarily my opinions. The lack of pushback you'll see is because of the nature of the show. Hi. Full disclaimer done.
Hello.
You prefer to be called Arch?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's pretty much what I've been called so far on the internet, so.
How long have you been on the internet? You kind of were your greatest internet saga of controversy was basically post Gamergate, right? 1 or 2 years after?
Probably, depending upon your definition of Gamergate, I suppose, but roundabout. I think I've been on the internet now for, it's gotta have been 10 years plus, I think. It's been a while.
Gotcha. Okay, and how's it treated you?
Quite well, honestly. It's an excellent job. I am a big, fat, lazy bastard, so I would hate to do a regular 9 to 5. So being able to work whenever I want is pretty great. And being able to go on the internet, talk to people, have conversations is always fun. It would have been a lot easier if I just stuck to doing simple lore, but, well, then Gamergate happened, and it was very clear that a lot of online stuff was going to get a lot more complicated, and, I'm happy with the choices I've made.
Okay, gotcha. So tell me, you said it depends on how you define Gamergate. How do you define Gamergate?
Well, from starting point, because I got onto the internet probably a year or two into Gamergate in the initial wave, and then there was a long period of kind of petering off when it was essentially clear that Gamergate hadn't really been able to defeat what it set out to defeat, because we didn't really know what we were fighting at the time. And so instead it became kind of various channels talking about sort of pseudo-similar things, then beginning to spiral off to the point where you still have quite a few of these channels today, in many cases doing other things or having evolved into other things. Like you still have your Sargon, your Dankula, your Metaker, your Armored Skeptic, etc., but many of them are now doing different things as well. So it kind of was this long trailing off period, I would say, where I was probably in the mid-trailing off period that the drama happened, I'd guess.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'm super curious. And so just so you know, I'm actually going to turn off my chat. I try to ignore them during the conversation because I find them super distracting. They are up on screen, but I'm not going to be looking at them. I'm covering them completely. Okay. So interesting the way that you phrased Gamergate. You said we didn't know what we were fighting. So obviously, when I look back, I was not part of the internet world during Gamergate. I was, I married into it. But my understanding is it was a kind of an SJW versus gamers situation in a very, very simplistic description, obviously. From this, it sounds like if I'm using that paradigm, you're on Team Gamer. So who's we, and what do you mean by we didn't quite know what we were fighting against?
Well, I think the broadest possible definition is, in essence, that you had a group of people who wanted to politicize entertainment. This was being done largely to push another form of politics, a more left-wing form of politics, which eventually evolved into what we know as progressivism today. Back then, however, they weren't anywhere near as open about it. In fact, it was very, very secretive at the time. The idea of social Marxism, for example, was a wild conspiracy theory that I remember my friend Sargon did a whole bunch of videos on this in which he was like, can we call this social Marxism? I don't know, but I feel like we could. And it was the era of Anita Sarkeesian, where people thought to begin with that she was just having a problem with video games, and that video games needed to evolve, and they would get so much better once they were talking about real topics. Back then, it was all framed, not in a political sense, but actually in the exact opposite, as if it was just other gamers doing things and having concerns about gaming. Even Anita Sarkeesian was defended at the time as if nobody had cared, she would have come along, done her videos, and then disappeared, which I very much so doubt, now knowing what it would eventually turn into. So the opposite side that I found myself on was basically a loose conglomeration of various individuals who were mostly into entertainment, be it TV, comics, gaming, etc., or even music, who started picking up on this weird vibe that something was changing in our entertainment. And we didn't really know what at the time, and so we began flailing around to figure out what was happening. And one of the earliest instances was, of course, the Kotaku incident. Kotaku, where there was a whole lot of allegations of, in essence, bribery within gaming news sites where sexual favors were traded for good reviews and coverage, etc. And even then, we didn't quite understand all of this. To us, it really did naively seem like we were dealing with a problem in the gaming media coverage rather than anything else. They just need ethic rules to behave like proper journalists. As we still thought that was a thing back then. That's why I describe us as not knowing what we were fighting, because none of us had any idea what we're doing here. None of us were educated in this. None of us had philosopher backgrounds or degrees or anything. We were just random people on the internet going, this is weird. What's happening here?
So when you said the Kotaku stuff, is this connected to Zoe Quinn?
Yeah, Zoe Quinn. I forgot the name off the top of my head. God, that has been a long time now.
Got you. So when you say we, was your perspective, when you think about your perspective in Gamergate, did you essentially, when did you feel like it became political, and when did you feel the need to start speaking more politically?
That was probably a little while in. I don't remember how long precisely, but it was specifically around the time when it began to become more obvious that the Anita Sarkeesian movement, for example, was not just about critiquing video games. It had an actual point. And at the time, it was feminism before it evolved and split away with progressivism. It then became clear that this was going to spread everywhere. This wasn't going to be confined to just a genre of gaming or critiquing of male characters or female characters, all of that. It was going to affect everything. And then, long before it actually got into Warhammer, I largely decided that, okay, I can talk about this now and try to head it off at the pass, or ignore it and wait until it catches up, and then I'll be stuck there like everybody else. So that's when I felt the urge to start talking about politics and about what was happening at the time. As even back then, our entire idea was to depoliticize the entertainment, which has turned out to be a somewhat naive notion.
Why did you want to depoliticize it?
Because it used to be depoliticized. It was viewed as a taboo. Back in the very olden days, probably 15, 20 years ago now, it was generally understood that if you were in a game store, for example, or a hobby store, you didn't talk about things like religion and politics because it wasn't important and it was divisive at the same time, and everyone largely just ignored each other's opinions on it. So that was the heydays that I had idealized, when everyone could get together and play games or anything else they wanted to do, and matters of politics was left to the boring old grey men who had to do it for a job.
So you've kind of outlined why we wanted to depoliticize entertainment, why we valued it as like kind of OG gamer bros. My question is, why did you care, Arch?
Because it was going to come from Warhammer. And I really liked Warhammer, and I would like for it to not go down that path. And, well, I wasn't able to prevent that, just like nobody else was able to prevent it infiltrating their other hobbies either. And so now, of course, GW is political and has even hired outright political activists, which is one of their recent little dramas around that.
And DW is?
Games Workshop, the creators of Warhammer 40,000.
Got you. Okay, so you feel, would I be correct if I was outlining how you feel about this when you think back at this time? Warhammer was kind of this like fun escape entertainment vector. It didn't have politics or any of the other bullshit. It was just a gaming in a world and a fantasy space that you could kind of immerse yourself into. And you did it for a career. And you saw the Gamergate controversy molding or becoming over time something political with a directional thrust that you felt had like wormed its way in or poisoned the thing that you love. Would that be a way to characterize how you felt about it at the time, at least?
Yeah, although even then, to begin with, I thought that Warhammer would be the most difficult thing to poison, as you say, with this, as it is a very male-centric setting. A lot of violence, not a whole lot of feelings, etc. A very brutally political in-universe with very little references to out-universe things. It has a very closed-off ecosystem in that regard. But I feel like, okay, might as well add to the insulation. And as it turned out, the problem wasn't the setting. Even if the setting can't necessarily be poisoned, then the company most certainly can. And at the end of the day, any made-up setting can be affected by the people who, well, made it.
So when you say you thought that it would be kind of like insulated from this politicization because it was male-centric and the world was kind of like space barbaric, it was very like dark and heavy world. What do you mean by that? Why do you think the barbarity of the fantasy world would insulate it, and why did you think the male-centric nature of it would insulate it?
Because the audience itself is not interested in outside politics. It's a world in which absolute dictatorship is necessary for basic survival. It is a world where the very tagline of the setting is, forget the false promises of progress. And therefore, everybody figured that a idea based entirely on progressivism would not find a lot of fertile ground here, as the entire setting is anti-progress, anti-technology. It views it as a dangerous force. There is virtually nothing left-wing in 40k. It is practically by definition an explicitly right-wing setting. And at the time, I wouldn't have used terms like that because I didn't understand that political element just yet.
Interesting. So you said that it was like a non-political space, but what you're actually describing is a fantasy literature that is like inherently political, at least in its predilections. So how do you maybe make sense of that? I feel like I'm misunderstanding a thread.
Okay. No, because here's the thing. At the time, it was right-wing, right? Absolutely so. Very... people have often accused the Imperium of being fascist, for example, and the only thing preventing the Imperium from being fascist is because it's too large to centrally govern, in essence. And that has never been a particularly popular political direction after the whole kerfuffle in the 1940s. And so it wasn't viewed as a reasonable political inspiration, Nobody sought to emulate Warhammer 40k. Even today, nobody was like, oh, 40,000, that sounds like a good system of government, right? And so nobody viewed it in a political lens because it seemed absurd. We will never apply 40k politically because that's a nightmare future where everyone's suffering and being eaten by aliens. Not exactly an aspirational state of being. Meanwhile, now, of course, that we have been told a lot more about politics, how everything is political, then yes, it is certainly far more right-wing than left-wing. It is individualistic. It is yourself first. It is about being assertive about one's own right. It is not bowing to external pressure, etc. It is storytelling as a narrative, a constructed narrative, rather than merely interpretive, as the left often wants to have, like, oh, well, if it's fiction, we can just change it to be more inclusive, etc. And Warren 40K is very much so, no. If you do that, then the internal consistency of the argument begins to fail. The universe falls apart.
Right, okay.
So that's, yeah. I feel like I don't explain that properly, but hopefully it'll sink in.
Gotcha. I think I'm understanding. Right. It's a fantasy world, and the reason you're saying it's not political, if I'm understanding, and then correct me if I'm wrong, is because the normative conclusions of the world isn't something somebody's aspiring towards, right? Nobody looks at 40K and goes like, that's who I want to be. That's the world that I want to like generate. In fact, it's in many ways like the opposite. It's this like fantasy literature world where the world itself is almost like a warning of being like, definitely don't want this world. It's almost prescriptively normative in the opposite direction, if it's normative at all, which it sounds like you're saying it wasn't normative. And by normative, I mean it doesn't prescribe things we ought to do. Whereas you would outline something political as saying, this is something we ought to strive towards. It's a directionality, often tied to morality, that we should pursue. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, that's correct. Because that's how I view politics. Because politics is, of course, making an argument for where we should go, right? It's about convincing people this is a good form of government. This is what we should be doing. Pointing, therefore, to the evil space empire that oppresses its population out of simple need for survival is not a very good political argument, no.
Sure. So in the midst of Gamergate, things got hairy for lots of creators. I actually personally know Aaron Ganji, who is Zoe Quinn's ex-boyfriend, who wrote the blog. Got hairy for a lot of people, and it got hairy for you. So I guess from your perspective, what happened with, I don't know, would you call it a cancellation? It was certainly a controversy.
I mean, I would, because it was basically an organized force of people from an external website going in and basically combing through the Discord back then for any messages that they could clip as far out of context as they could and then present them in a negative light. So I wouldn't call it a cancellation.
Could you, before you go on, could you describe to me your Discord? Because the Discord logs, I think, are the one thing that I wanted to pull up and maybe go through with you. But before we do that, what was your Discord like? Because every Discord has a very different, distinct, unique culture, especially in modern day. Discord is increasingly becoming important to understand.
Well, the Discord was created basically just for a place for people to hang out. That was the original idea. And I figured, like, okay, well, everyone on here is friends, and so they can just do whatever they want, interact with each other in whatever they want. And it was very laissez-faire and very hands-off on the moderation side. And that turned out to be a bad idea in the long term, of course. But it was just intended to be a place where everybody could hang out and talk to each other in this fan community that I'd created.
How did you go about managing? So, like, I have a pretty free speech Discord as well. And as you know, when you do that, it creates lots of problems because free speech also means people can be dickheads to each other. How did you guys go about managing nasty comments or negative comments or slurs or anything like that? Like, was it just managing the minimum Discord TOS and that's about it? Or how did you resolve problems?
Oh, not even really that. Like, because the ideal back then was we all thought we would have, as close to absolute free speech as possible. And so the management, I just left to a bunch of people who volunteered and like, okay, well, I'm sure everything will be fine. I didn't really think about it more than that.
Did you spend time in your Discord?
Occasionally, but not that much because, time restraints. But I used to speak there, freely, which was in part the problem, as I have learned since.
Gotcha. So I did go through and dig up old leaks. So obviously the controversy around you, from my understanding, started when Discord logs got leaked of you saying some things that people did not like. Would you say that that's the correct beginning of it, or was there anything that happened before then?
Well, what happened before then was that I'd already been targeted for years and years. I had initially started doing just Warhammer content because they had announced Warhammer Total War, and since I loved Warhammer and Total War, figured, okay, I want to do something around this. And I've always been a fan of racial comedy, so I was making jokes like that even back then when it was still more or less YouTube TOS to allow you to do so. And when I started talking politics, of course, I very quickly became unpopular with the dominant political movement at the time, which was very left-wing. I used to be in contact with companies like Creative Assembly, the makers of Total War, but the moment I started critiquing their setting a bit too much, I lost contact with them and became cancelled by these companies quite quickly.
Gotcha.
So I'd already been controversial for probably 2-3 years, probably, before any of this actually happened.
Okay. So I'm going to try to share my screen with you so you can see what I'm looking at, and hopefully other people can too. Can you see this?
I can see that.
Okay. So I'm just going to check my stream here for a second to see how dark it is. It's pretty dark. We'll go like this. Okay, so these were leaked. These are comments from, it looks like 2020.
2020.
So in the 05, so the beginning of COVID. And you are this like dark arch symbol here. That's your PFP on YouTube.
Yes.
So you got comments like, they were also kind of blackies to think paint rendered them invulnerable to bullets, barbed wire, by the way. What does that mean? Is that like in reference, is that lore? Is that Warhammer lore, blackies?
No, the Dahomey Indian, African tribe, the Dahomey. This was in reference to the French campaign against the Dahomey. The Dahomey had a belief that if they put on magical paint, it would protect them against bullets and be able to break barbed wire with their bare hands. As you can probably imagine, this did not work out quite as well as they had intended.
Gotcha. Black history in 3 easy steps: get captured by black people, get sold by black people, get liberated by white people. Any questions? And obviously that was just in and of itself.
I 100% stand by it, however.
Gotcha.
That comment has aged like fine fucking wine, in my opinion.
Okay. Pretty sure it had a Ching Chong author.
Mm-hmm. Like, again, I came from an area where racial humor was entirely normal. Ching Chong was just a normal word for Chinese people in comedy back then.
Sure. And is there any context to this, or?
Somebody was asking if the writer of a book, who it was, and I was just like, I'm pretty sure he's Chinese, but I couldn't remember his name, or spell it for that matter.
Okay. And we've got... maybe God does hate yellow people, unpopular opinion, but the Chinese deserved it. I mean, the locusts do seem to be setting a pattern. Bright side of life.
I don't remember the context of this. I think it was some kind of ancient disaster about the Yellow River flooding. And obviously, I am being tongue-in-cheek here. Like, God, 1, I'm not sure he's real. 2, I don't think he floods the Yellow River solely to kill Chinese people, etc.
Gotcha.
So, joke.
Gotcha. Real fascism leads to a utopian state where every member is both spiritually and physically fulfilled whilst living in as much luxury as a state can possibly afford.
Mm-hmm. And the next comment after that is how the left views fascism, as in the left says communism, it leads to a utopian state where every member of society will live in the highest level of luxury the state can afford. And so I simply say, okay, well, that's exactly what fascism aspires to. That is the words of Evola, like, okay, well, if we just get all of the power, it'll be utopian. Everyone will live spiritually fulfilled. Everyone will have fantastic lives. However, reality seems to disagree with this assertion.
Okay, so these get leaked. It sounds like essentially you're saying, I stand by all of these jokes or comments. Some are jokes, yes. Some were comments, right? It sounds like the fascist one was commentary, kind of like tongue-in-cheek commentary, kind of critiquing
yes.
Marxists. Okay,
yes.
So you stand by everything. Okay. So what happened?
Well, for me and my community, these were obviously jokes and or political critiques. Like the last one, for example, literally the next line is, that is how the communists presents themselves, explaining it. But this was cut out of context because the intent, of course, was to paint me in the most negative light possible. And at the time, I thought nothing of it. I just figured, okay, well, we can talk about anything on the internet, right? And that was it. Now, in retrospect, I, of course, have learned that if you take things out of its context and present it to people who don't understand the community, who don't know the character, etc., the person speaking, their humor, and simple text not communicating humor very well, it can easily be misconstrued in the most negative fashion possible. That is exactly what happened here. In essence, it's a tale of a young, dumb, naive Arch thinking his little corner of the internet would remain insulated from everything else.
Yeah, so I'm glad you kind of threw in that personal piece there. It's interesting. I don't know if you noticed this when we talk, you do a lot of intellectualizing and there's not a lot of like you present. Because I'm curious also like how you thought and felt about these things. So you described yourself as young, dumb Arch who is naive about, the world broadly. Could you maybe describe that to me? Like, what do you, if you could go back and talk to yourself pre-2020, would you give yourself advice? Would you change anything? Like what do you feel like has shifted in your mindset since then? That you're not naive, I'm presuming now.
I just tell young Arch that, no. Everything you say will be posted on the internet somewhere. Assume that, and so be very careful about what you say. You mentioned like speaking in an intellectual fashion. I guess that's kind of the result of that, learning that, okay, you've got to speak properly, right? You have to try and explain your position as well as possible, I guess, as immediately as possible, and not be as laid back, as trusting, I suppose. As that is probably the biggest word of advice I'd give to my younger self. Don't trust people on the internet.
Gotcha. So the intellectualizing that we're talking about, you feel like it's somewhat developed as like I don't know if you'd call it a defense mechanism. I'm not sure what language you would use precisely there, but a sort of mechanism of management in response to understanding that your words will constantly potentially get clipped out of context. So you need to give full kind of intellectual explanations of it. And I'm not sure if you feel this way, but simultaneously need to look as not defensive as possible while doing so.
Possibly. I think the last part, if anything, is subconscious, but it's also just because, again, back then, we knew nothing about what was going on. This was still viewed as simply just a battle for free speech, in essence, where we didn't understand the political aspect of things. Now that I understand a lot more about the political aspect of things, it introduces a lot more words that are more descriptive and easier to use. So my language has evolved with increased understanding of the subject matter at hand, basically.
Gotcha.
Not necessarily intentional, just because it's more effective, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Tell me if we can slightly shift tones. Let's go like way back. Okay, so you've been doing content for 10 years. It's a long time. What got you into 40K? What got you into YouTube content in the first place? Why did you start making YouTube videos about, of all things, as somebody who's not very into the Warhammer world, Warhammer lore YouTube, I have discovered, is a very big thing. I have a friend who does Warhammer lore content as well. What got you into that? Because you were one of the first adopters of this style, I believe, as well, correct?
Yeah, Warhammer YouTube as it exists today, I can say, without a whole lot of exaggeration, is basically my creation. As before me, there was precisely one larger creator, Vox Imperialis, maybe? something along those lines.
Okay.
And it wasn't viewed as particularly, lucrative or something that people did. I started doing it and had a lot of success, and it created a lot of people after me. I simply started doing it because I've been interested in Warhammer for a very long time, since my grandmother, who didn't understand a word of English, saw a bunch of pretty figures in the toy store and thought, oh, well, my grandchild likes English, and these seems like pretty figures, and she bought me a box of Warhammer figurines.
Interesting. So it's your grandma that got you into 40K, Gran.
Yes.
What would you...
Having no idea what it was.
So what language did she speak? Are you Norwegian or you...
Norwegian, yes.
Norwegian, okay. So I don't know what do Norwegian people call their grandma?
Mimi, in this case.
Mimi? So Mimi was the first 40K adopter inadvertently.
Yes.
Okay.
She also bought me Animal Farm at the tender age of 12.
Oh. Mimi was edgy.
Very much so.
Yeah, that's crazy. Do you think she knew what she was getting you?
Had not the faintest idea. She saw a book, Nick, called Animal Farm and pretty little animals on it and thought, well, that's fitting for my grandson.
Interesting. It's actually quite interesting that these are like two themes that got introduced to you very easily, because there's a lot of similarities and obviously a lot of dissimilarities between Animal Farm and 40K from my understanding. So you get these figurines. How does that evolve into a full-blown passion? Like, how does one get into 40K? Because my understanding, my husband's been trying to get into 40K, but he's like, to do so, I need to watch like hours of lore. And I'm just like, why would you ever pick up a hobby where you just need to watch a bunch of videos or read a bunch of books? But whatever you're into. So why?
That's true. Well, after getting the first miniatures, I found a magazine that talked about it, and it had a battle report in it where they talk about how they play the game, and that enthralled me. And I read that book to literal pieces, and then I found as many of the books I could in the local toy store, because they had no idea what this was either. And I just started vociferously reading everything I could get across. And my love for the setting remained all the way then until eventually Creative Assembly made a total war game about it. And that was the moment where I was like, okay, this is going to be awesome. I want in on this conversation. And, well, making YouTube videos seemed the best way to do it. At the time, I had no plans of that being a career or anything, but, here we are, I guess.
Sure. So how old were you when you got that first box set of figurines?
Not very old. Probably, I think it was a couple of years after Animal Farm, I think. So maybe I was 13, 14 or something like that.
Okay. So 13, 14, and then this became your life. So it's been, I don't know how old you are now.
52.
You're 52. So it's been a part of your life for like almost 4 decades.
That's a lie I tell my audience, by the way.
I was going to say, there's no way you're 52. You don't look 52, but I'm also not going to question people's age. How old are you actually?
I don't want to say, because that will ruin the joke.
Okay, fair enough.
But it's been a part of my life for decades.
Okay. I'm going to guess you're in your 30s, if I'm being honest.
Yes.
Based, okay. Okay, so it's been in your life for decades. You start making content on it. Were you working at the time? Like, did you have a full-time job that you were able to end to go into YouTube?
Partially. I was originally taking an education in 3D modeling and design because I wanted to get into games development, as everyone did back then. Then the economic crash happened, where games development basically died for a little bit. And it's like, okay, well, this is not going to happen. What else am I going to do, right? So I looked around for a few years trying to figure out what I wanted to do, worked in the family company for a while, as we have a family company that does robotics now. And I was never the kind of guy who was happy with the 9-to-5 job. I could do it. I'd clock in and be a zombie for a few hours and then, awaken again as I left the door. But this seemed like a fun thing to do, and it's something I was genuinely passionate and interested in. So, okay, let's start doing this. And I was one of the lucky few who had the right combination of charisma, timing, and luck to make a career out of YouTube.
Gotcha. Okay. So your family company does robotics. Is your family quite educated then as well?
No, the exact opposite.
Interesting. Okay, so they're kind of like they're like the artists who build the skill.
Yes, my mother has a high school education, and my father has parts of college education. That's it. But my father created his own company that started out doing machining using CNC technology. One of the first companies in Norway to start doing that, and eventually having transitioned into robotics as the automation of the future.
Yeah. Okay.
Gen X.
Remind me in 2 minutes, because I have to let her out of her timeout when she's calm. If I forget. Can you hear her like screaming and howling in the background? Is it not too bad?
Just a tiny bit, but it's not a problem.
Okay, so family does robotics. Your dad created a company in Norway, the first CNC company. So you grew up in Norway. Are you still in Norway?
Yes, been in Norway all my life. Except for a brief stint in Okinawa for about a year.
Interesting. I don't think I've met anybody from Norway. Is your accent typical? I feel like you don't have a typical Norwegian accent.
Well, the typical Norwegian accent is more a la PewDiePie, because he's Swedish, so he's got kind of a similar cadence. But I always disliked that. Plus, I didn't learn English in school. I learned English from the television.
Gotcha. Okay. Do you have any siblings, anything like that?
Nope, only child.
Okay, so only child, family does robotics. Are you interested in robotics at all? Or no, you were going to go into graphic design and stuff?
Well, at the time, we weren't doing robotics either, because we were still doing machining of parts. Specifically, the specialization then was packaging machines. So, whenever you get a package in the store, it was probably packed by a machine rather than a human these days. And that was mostly just like a regular machine operator job more so than anything, with the occasional design elements of making pieces, but that was about it. Never something that particularly appealed to me. Robotics, I'm interested in on the level of what it can do for us technologically and civilizationally, because robotics is absolutely the future. And particularly if the West, with its continuously declining birth rates, are going to have any chance to compete and reassert itself with the third world and India and China, etc., we have to adopt robotics, and on a much larger scale than we already have. Plus, ideally speaking, robotics, it's not there to replace the worker. It is to allow workers to do more important stuff. So, on that level, I like robotics. And I do some basic programming of it, but it's not something that I've done on a massive scale.
Sure. Okay. So family does machining. They get into robotics later in life. You're interested in graphic design, but you get into content pretty early on in your career, and you're able to, when were you able to pivot to full-time? How many years into making content?
It was pretty quick, honestly, because I grew very quickly. Probably year and a half, 2 years, roundabout, maybe.
Okay. And you've been full-time content creation since then?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So I guess I'm curious, tell me about life in Norway, like growing up. What is that like, being an only child in Norway? Did your grandma live with you, or like where was Mimi?
She lives next door, or lived, as we have our house is the old family farm, as the family used to have a plot of land over here. Of course, my father came from a different part, where they used to have a whole lot of land, but the house they had actually burnt down, and my grandfather, or what would be the English word for father of grandfather?
Father of grandfather. Great-grandfather.
Great-grandfather, thank you. great-grandfather and my grandfather rebuilt the house over the course of like 2 years in the manual, old-fashioned way by themselves. And that was intended to be a generational home back then, because Norway didn't have oil yet. So it was a dirt-poor agricultural country. So the house was built in two portions, where one was supposed to be my grandfather's and grandparents, and the other was supposed to be my parents'. But my father was quite entrepreneuring from an early age and wanted to start his own company. And his grandparents lived in an area in the middle of nowhere, Lapland, which is a mountain village, nothing around there. It doesn't even have the infrastructure to support industry. So he moved to the place where my grandmother family was and my mother, which they had a large family farm. And upon this now, we have quite a lot of our family. So the grandmother used to live in one house that we built our house next to, because again, generational housing was entirely normal back then. Right next to us is my aunt and uncle, which also have a generational house, which was intended for their children. So we live now on this fairly large plot of land there with a nice little bit of forest above it. And that was, the norm over here. Everyone has large plots of land. Everyone lives on these large areas, quite isolated and insulated from one another. The nearest point of civilization is about 5 kilometers through the thickest forest you've ever known away. And that's a village, the official designation of village. And it used to be about 100 people in a church. It's a bit more now, but, Norway was very, very insular and isolated at the time.
Yeah.
After that,
Oh, go ahead.
Hang on.
I was going to ask about schooling. Were you homeschooled? Did you go to the school in village? What does the schooling situation look like?
A village school, a fairly standard basic education as everybody else.
Yeah, so just public school.
Yep.
Did you enjoy public school?
No.
Do you want to tell me about that?
I viewed it even back then as an enormous waste of time, as the majority of the skills public school teaches you is simply not applicable in real life more often than not. And I was probably, this is going to sound like I'm awfully full of myself, but I was probably cleverer than most of the children around me. And so I hated school. I fucking hated school. I was put in an advanced class in English. Did very well there until I managed to piss my teacher off by correcting them, as I was a little shit. And then I got put in penalty classes in school for a while, where you would be basically treated like a retard child, and you'd be given super easy lessons. And I had to actually have my parents campaign with the school board and members of it to go listen, he's not an idiot. We can demonstrate that. He's being punished by his teachers. So,
gotcha.
Largely my fault.
Gotcha. So when I get back, because I need to let my dog out of her timeout, I'm going to ask you, so you have a second to think, what do you think was the most important lesson you earned from your school years? What was the most kind of meaningful memory or event that happened that you learned from? And I'll be right back.
That's actually a really difficult question, chat, because I can't really come up with anything. I feel like this is the point where I'm supposed to say something that defines me and something very, deep, but I don't know if I can come up with anything.
Okay.
Well, I gotta say, you give me a difficult question here, because I feel like, honestly, largely, I was almost on autopilot throughout the entirety of school. Because nothing really struck me as particularly interesting in school. Beyond probably history, which I was always frustrated by how there wasn't enough of it, and being taught about the past. As, honestly, school was just shit. Mediocre, normal, boring. I guess, if anything, what it taught me was that mediocrity is normal, I suppose.
Gotcha. What does that mean to you when you say mediocrity is normal? Does that apply to yourself, or is that how you view others?
Not necessarily how I view others. How I view the system, more correctly, as like school's always been one of my pet peeves in that it doesn't raise members of society that can truly integrate with society and steer it. It educates people for work, in essence, to slot into the machinery at large. And even then, it doesn't do it particularly well either, as the majority of the skills it teaches you doesn't prepare you for life in employment. And even if you do have something very specific that requires a lot of education, like high-level mathematicians, for example, 98% of the stuff you learn in, basic education is worthless once you begin on your proper education anyways, and so on. So I felt like the entire system of school was a system created to simply exist and to fulfill a curriculum, and that was about it. Like, whether or not the children in school did well or could benefit from that was kind of irrelevant. It was just about passing X number of kids out of the school system every year, and the teachers more or less shrugged and went, oh, well, it's the checklist.
Gotcha. So I guess, do you feel like the mass literacy and like mass reading and stuff that is a result of education, do you think that's worthwhile, or do you feel that there just should be more added to education?
I mean, literacy is one of the few elements that is worthwhile, but hell, even these days, literacy is more often taught by electronic means than in schools. It's like through interacting with things like iPads, etc. But obviously, literacy is something we should teach people how to read and write, because that's the basis of passing on more complicated technology, or complicated knowledge, more correctly. But like, things that we don't focus on, for example, is how our democracy works, how you vote, how politics is formed, philosophy, how to make up your own mind properly. As Norway has had a long-standing problem with the majority of the population basically voting out of habit more so than anything else. People will pick a political party and stick with that political party as just a matter of course. Most people think they should vote because that's democracy, but most people never really then engage with why and for whom to vote, kind of bastardizing the entire system. And especially when it comes to things like history, learning the lessons of the past is probably the single most important goal for an educational institution. As, if we had literally just looked up on errors of censorship previously, we wouldn't be repeating a lot of the mistakes we are currently doing. Or how to simply just live, right? Paying taxes, registering yourself for services, health services, how to get unemployment benefits, your rights, interacting with the police, etc., etc., etc. School should be far more about getting people ready to actually live rather than checking boxes.
Sure. So, and you feel that school essentially fails that, like people don't leave school knowing how to live.
Yes, it was 10 years of more or less completely wasted time in my regard.
Gotcha. How do you think people should make up their mind?
Well, the fundament of this must begin with a solid education, and it needs to be all of it. See, you can't just teach people the philosophical tools, because if you basically just teach critical thinking, and I'm not meaning as in the progressive form here, but how to analyze an idea instead, you begin to get a generation of very deconstructive minds, where you start questioning everything because you don't have a frame of reference. Well, why don't we allow people to kill people? And then you begin deconstructing the idea, well, because it's bad for society. Okay, but why do we care that it's bad for society? Well, because I live with it. Okay, but why do you live in it? Why don't you transform society? And you begin debuilding the idea, debuilding morality. And that way lies fucking madness, as we've now been able to quite thoroughly demonstrate. So it would be better to begin at the very start. Begin by teaching Greek philosophers, even nonsense such as, oh, we're all made up of fire. No, we're all made up of water. No, it's all earth, etc. And then begin building up throughout the eras of political philosophy to give as broad an education on it as possible. That way, you'll go through all of it, including things like Marxism, socialism, etc., and now the modern ideas of democracy and how that functions and how our system functions and why we believe this to be a good system. Because you need to understand all of it and not just a single piece. But the problem is that is an education that'll probably take years, and not one that I necessarily think would stick well in the mind of children. So it's not one that I have a good plan for.
Gotcha. So while you like aren't a big fan of the education system, you're not making any normative claims about how it ought to be specifically different in any such way.
No, not other than what it should focus on, basically. So, I mean, we still need education, obviously. It's just that I disagree with what it focuses on.
Gotcha. So school was dull. You don't feel like you learned that much. When do you feel like you started learning?
Honestly, when I started doing YouTube.
Okay.
That was probably it, because then I had to, do YouTube. That was obviously a big learning experience, as, I knew 3D graphics, but I didn't know how to edit a video, I didn't know how to record a video, how to get audio, how to make thumbnail, how Photoshop worked, none of that. So that was a massive learning experience there. And then came the political aspect, of course, where I think all of us are still learning that, which is also another testament to how massively the educational system failed us. That when we started talking about politics, none of us had any idea of what we were talking about, and had to build most of our ideas practically from the ground up, and then also watching other creators, reading on it, etc. And I mean, that has been probably the biggest transformative experience, beginning to understand how broad the world is in this regard.
Gotcha. So it's interesting, talking about how YouTube kind of like broadened your world, even though the YouTube content that you're doing is actually fantasy about a world that doesn't exist. What do you think has been some of the most important lessons then that you learned through your YouTube career?
Important lessons, huh? Well, beyond the simple ability to learn how to make things, it's definitely taught me that if you want to make anything, you've just got to start making it and then start working on it, building it up slowly but surely. Success may come quickly, it may come slowly, but it won't come at all unless you put in the effort to make it come. That would probably be the biggest one. And also a whole lot on the human experience, like how other people act and how the internet tends to atomize individuals a great deal.
So in existential psychology, we have this view of people that's like, we're like a stool. There's like three major prongs that build up our worldview. And when one of those prongs get knocked away, it can often topple us. So we have an intrinsic view of self, a view of others, and then a view of the world broadly. I'm curious, how do you view yourself? Like if you had to describe yourself to people, what would that look like?
That's a difficult one. How would I view myself? That's not really something I've considered much, honestly. A fan, maybe? Because I've always been interested in doing things for things. Like Warhammer is the reason why I started doing politics. So, I mean, if I was allowed to live in the 2000s forever, I mean, I'd probably just do videos on an entity that I like Warhammer, for example, and not care about the broader world. Like, I'm far more interested in trying to bring us back to that point of everything was nice, basically. Because it feels like we had a golden era there, where we're now past it. We have lost our golden era. And it kind of defines me to try to recapture that. So, I feel like there's a much better way of putting that, but I've never thought about that question.
Why do you think you haven't thought about that question? You seem like somebody who does think about things at length.
Maybe, but rarely about myself. I don't think I'm particularly important in the grand scheme of things. It would be more like what I can do, like building a YouTube channel is important. Having a community around it is important. Having people listen to what I say, I suppose, is important. Being able to entertain people is important. Me, myself, I kind of just do those things. And I enjoy doing those things, so...
It's very interesting because one of the things that you outlined that you dislike about school is that it's preparing people to be like a cog in a slot and habituated. But in many ways, when you describe yourself, you're mostly just what you do. Like there's a sense that when you describe this thing where I say it's not quite the same cog that public school puts you into, but you're kind of putting yourself into a cog wheel a little bit too. You're being like, well, I'm just the things that I do. How are these the same or how are these different?
Sort of, but I think we are all the things that we do to some extent, because we are defined by our actions, largely, I believe. And in this case, I am defined by what I do. Like I do fan content is what I would prefer to do, but that was not an option in the long term. And so I need to start doing more political elements. And I don't want to say that that is what defines me in the political and the philosophical sphere, because it's not what I would have preferred to do. It's something I do partially out of necessity, right? I would have loved to have simply remained a guy that talks about Warhammer, and it probably would have been more profitable in the long term to do it, but I guess that's kind of the element of it. There's a degree of... I don't want to say self-sacrifice because it sounds far too pompous, but an understanding that, okay, this thing that I like will be destroyed unless I do something about it, and so some actions need to be taken to prevent that from happening. And yeah, no, I think that is a better way to put it, like the value of the action, because over the years, too, I have grown kind of distasteful of many individuals within the Warhammer community sphere that never addresses these things, that never brings it up, that never mentions how Warhammer is becoming observably worse, that simply remain trapped in a fandom bubble, because it's like, okay, but you see the thing that you like is rotting. You love an apple and you see it turning to shit in front of you, and you just decide to sit there and stare at the apple as it rots. It feels wrong to me, so I don't like the inaction.
What do you think is, like, it sounds like there's a principle, right? Like, you recognize that by getting more political yourself, it sounds like you're saying it came at a cost to my career. I would have been more successful if I never did, making more money. Well, you said I would be more profitable if I just stuck to Warhammer or I hadn't been political.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I wasn't talking about any of that, I had contacts with the people making Warhammer, with people making Creative Assembly. They were inviting me to events and stuff. If I'd simply just kept my mouth shut and been the corporate tool, I would have been much, much, much larger than I am now, and I'd probably be earning a lot more money than I am now. But I would also be basically a parasite living off a corpse in the long term, just watching the thing I'm covering grow slowly worse, unable to do anything about it, you know? It's...
What do you do about it now?
Well, changing the culture is the grandiose way of putting it. It is illuminating the errors, showing them to as many people as possible, and convincing them of my point of view, which is that, well, in essence, things were better before. And this is how we got here, and this is how we need to extricate ourselves from this position.
Gotcha. So when you look at like a world and lore, how do you think it can develop? Because I think as things evolve, right, even as D&D evolves, there's ways that we can update it and build it and grow it that I think most fans would think are really good. And then there's ways that we can evolve it and grow it that might violate maybe the core principle, right? This is like the classic Disney remake movie where they remake Lilo and Stitch, but suddenly it's like not about any of the values that Lilo and Stitch were about in the first place, right? It kind of betrays the heart of the thing. So how do you go about, you know, if you say like Warhammer went down one path, that is like the rot, it's betraying, I imagine what you think is like its principles to some degree. how would you like to have seen that be different?
Well, that brings up, of course, a more interesting question again around the morality of it, the heart of it. Now, we used a lot of terms like this, even back in the day, like the soul of an entity, the heart of it, because we couldn't quantify what it was. What it really is largely things like morality, ethics, ideas. And if we break that down yet further, you can find politics in it. But it was more about normative human emotions and behavior, right? And a lot of the old school, like Lilo and Stitch, as you mentioned, family. A simple topic everybody understands, everybody can, associate with to some degree, idealize, like it's a simple principle. And most of the old entertainment had simple principles like this. Whereas the follow-up of Lilo and Stitch then does most of the same things as Lilo and Stitch, but now the sister leaves. She breaks the family willingly. In fact, it is presented as a positive thing to break the family. And that is a very massive deviation from the original idea. And I do believe that makes for a worse product, because there are ways to iterate upon things. There is a character in Warhammer 40,000, for example, called Leman Russ. He is the classic barbarian warlord king, a big, brutish savage, right? But in a series of background novels, it is revealed that this is a part he puts on because he is a Primarch, which is a genetically engineered superhuman, basically. So he is ridiculously intelligent. And he understands a lot more than he lets people let on. He plays the part of the silly barbarian king as the savage because he knows that is what people want from it, is what people need. The emperor, the big boss man, needs Leman Russ to be a barbarian warrior, and so that is what Leman Russ is. That is an iterative change. That is the author going, well, I mean, he's a Primarch. Of course he's going to be super smart, so why would he still play the savage? Oh, well, it's because that's the role he needs to play. It builds upon his idea, his character, rather than contradicting it. And in far too much of modern entertainment, it is the contradiction that we've focused on rather than the iterative parts.
Gotcha. So then I guess I think I know the answer to this, but I still want to ask it. Why did it matter to you so much to fight for what you would maybe classify as the soul of this world, 40K, so much so that it cost you career potentials, potentially I believe you got cut out from talking to GW. So in at least a major significant way in losing contact with that group.
Oh yeah, I've been officially blacklisted by Games Workshop. They have a contractual agreement they sign with the various companies they work with that forbids them from working with me. And I've seen that contract, so yeah. I'm their boogeyman. But I mean, that too really comes down to morality. I didn't want to do it because I believe that not doing it is wrong. Like, to just stand by and watch a thing you like be destroyed is wrong, and you shouldn't do it. It makes you a worse person if you do that. So, simple as value judgment, really.
Gotcha. Okay. So when I asked you who you are, you took a while and then you said a fan. What do you think of the world at large? How do you view the world?
We've definitely taken a wrong turn, mainly by focusing too much on, well, we can extrapolate in this quite a bit, as our current world is largely defined by the politics of the old world. We're a consequence of the 1900s great upheavals, in essence, where that was a consequence of the 1700s as great upheavals, as we had the idea of building something greater, something better, a better world, utopia. And we had many ideas of that, massive numbers of ideas of that. Democracy is the one we eventually came up with as probably the best one. But we had competing ideas like socialism, for example. And a lot of modern day progressivism stems from Antonio Gramsci's initial idea of wondering, why isn't the revolution happening? Because it was the assumption made that after Russia rose in revolt, the rest of the world would probably start rising too, because surely the workers would understand that they are being exploited. Okay. Didn't happen. So Gramsci was like, right, why? Well, it's because we've made democracy, liberalism, the normative values. They've become our morality, and you can't have people rise against their own morality. Now, he was then, of course, imprisoned and eventually died in prison under Mussolini, another socialist. But his ideas have now kind of popped back up again in modern-day progressivism, which has this idea of trying to break down the world, to deconstruct it. Everything must be deconstructed because they're all elements of something bad, be it colonialism, imperialism, etc. And to begin with, it wasn't even openly socialist or Marxist. It just began with, well, why do you like the woman in the tight leather outfit? Why do you like Catwoman? And people were like, well, because she's hot? Well, that's a bad thing. That's sexist. And all of us, being good liberals at the time, were like, well, I guess. You have a point, that is sexist, I suppose. And then we deconstructed that, eventually resulting in the uglified female characters of today. This then grew into a much larger movement on a much larger political basis, where right now we are in a midst of a battle between progressivism, which wishes to ever progress towards socialism, and to have socialism, we must first break down normative society, liberalism, democracy, whatever you'd like to call it, to then get the new and better state of being. I disagree. I think we were in a pretty fucking fantastic spot in the late 2090s, and I'd like to go back there. And for me, a lot of that is defined by entertainment. Our entertainment taught simple, basic lessons that brought up, decent human beings. The world was working, and I'd like to recreate that, basically.
Right. So, trying to summarize, your view of the world is essentially kind of this progressive human wrestling of upheavals followed by upheavals, and these all affect each other kind of sequentially. I noticed there in you, did you say that Mussolini was a socialist?
Yes.
Gotcha. Even though most people would label him as a fascist.
Well, fascism is an off-branch of socialism. Antonio Gramsci and Mussolini were largely in agreement on many points. Both of them were wondering, as we can see in their early writings, why isn't the revolution happening? Mussolini himself was, of course, writing for the communist newspaper during the First World War, and he viewed the First World War as an opportunity for that revolution, for military might, for glory, to build up Italy, and that would eventually then turn into a workers' revolution or a soldiers' revolution. When it didn't happen, he was like, okay, well, whilst Antonio Gramsci was, okay, I'm going to create a revolution by breaking down the norms of our society to create the growing bed for revolution, whereas Mussolini decided, nah, I don't have the patience for that. It's going to take too long. It's boring. I want a revolution. I am going to create my revolution. And that is what he did. Sure.
So I guess the question that I'm asking there is, I think it's very interesting that most people would just call Mussolini a fascist, but I think you're very intentional in explicitly calling him a socialist. And I'm not so much curious about the ideas as to why, because I'm sure that you do have reasons as to why you say this. I'm curious as to why there's a part of you that really wants to be accurate to the ideas I think that you believe, and like not play into maybe like what the social group, like when people call him a fascist, do you feel as though that's incorrect when they say that?
No, he's a fascist, but fascism is a breakoff of socialism, in the same way that socialism was a breakoff of syndicalism. So in the same way syndicalism eventually evolved from the revolutionary ideas.
Sure, yeah, they get born from each other. But you said he's a fascist, but you also called him a socialist initially. So I'm just curious, because usually we don't call socialists syndicalists. Like, we don't do this, right? We call them socialists. So I'm curious why. Not because I'm not, this isn't about like a disagreement. I think there's something interesting going on that I'm trying to understand about how you think and speak.
Well, it's partially a condemnation measure. It is to tie socialism to fascism because that's where it belongs, as it has been largely tied to right-wing thought rather than left-wing thought, and that is objectively incorrect when you see where they stem from. In the same way, the actual end goal is in many ways the same. The socialists wish for perfect communism. Perfect communism is in essence a utopia, where you've created this stateless, classless society. Where fascism differs is that it believes that you can't have that. It violates the laws of nature and humanity. You have to have a state. But the end result, to have fully fulfilled human beings that live their best lives possible spiritually, as that is a lot of the elements of communism as well, the spirit of the people, and with the luxury that can be provided by an organized society, then that will be utopia. Both promise the same thing, they just have slightly different solutions on how to deliver it.
Gotcha. So, okay, interesting. So I wrote down, you said, I'm calling Mussolini a socialist because I need to tie it to left-wing thought, which is kind of what I was wondering what was happening. Is there for you a need to kind of remind or stick it to people that like the left presents a great kind of democratic threat in a way where like a lot of society, especially during Gamergate, was mostly focused on fascism and the right and authoritarianism for the right. Do you, in saying it this way, you need to tie it to left-wing thought, which is what you said. Are you trying to remind people, being like, actually the left can be just as evil? Is that what's going on? Like, what's the need to tie it?
Oh, in part, yes. Like, at the end of the day, politics is a game of optics and understanding, of communicating one's ideas to the crowd in the most effective way. And the left was way, way better than our side at that for a very, very long time. And part of that is talking to the average person who has no idea about any of this, who probably don't want to have any idea about any of this, and therefore the left saying, well, fascism is a right-wing ideal, therefore the exact opposite of us, kind of the trick that they use Antifa. What does Antifa mean? Well, it means anti-fascist, whereas we know that that's not really the purpose of their stuff anymore. And therefore, I can go, okay, right, you want to play this game? Very well. I believe fascism is left-wing, and here's my reason for believing so, and I'm going to repeat that to hammer it home into the minds of normal people. And it doesn't hurt either that I pretty much believe that my view of the world in that regard is more correct.
So it's a somewhat subversive tongue-in-cheek to kind of like play the same game as other people are playing.
Yeah, in an element. I mean, even back then, you had some truly amusing exchanges between Mussolini and Gramsci, for example, where they were arguing about which one was the most subversive force in society, as that was a virtue then, to subvert the government, the institutions, the establishment. So at the end of the day, we all have to be somewhat subversive to our opponent, otherwise they will simply be able to state, this is reality. And if you can't subvert that, you have nothing. You must have an opposing view of the world. Otherwise, well, you don't have a counter-argument.
Why do you need to be subversive to have a counter-argument or like an alternative view of the world? Why do you think
Well, by
that?
subversive here, we mean basically to undercut their argument, because there's nothing sneaky about this. I can pretty much demonstrate that Mussolini came from socialism, that he was a communist, and what he did was basically just an extrapolation of the revolutionist ideas at the time. I don't believe there's anything dishonest about it, and I believe I can prove it.
Sure, but you
to the
also,
left, of course,
just to pause though, but you also agree, like most people call him a fascist. And again, I'm not really getting stuck on calling him a fascist or a socialist because I don't like either side. You know, I'm the type of left person who's been saying for years, we need to kick the socialists and the communists out. I don't know why the fuck they've ever been part of the club, right? So I'm not predilected. What's interesting to me is that it is the subversive thing that you are doing there. I think it's very interesting because it's the first thing in this conversation that has kind of surprised me, that I didn't expect from you as I've gotten to know you. Not that I know you particularly well, but you've seemed like somebody who seems to be quite direct and tries to use the most accurate word for the thing. Whereas when you call Mussolini a socialist, I went, that's not really the most accurate word. The most accurate word is fascist, because that's essentially what his regime became. Even though, yeah, fascistic thinking often came from socialist thinking, there's a reason why we still separate these two things. He's doing that intentionally because he's pretty intentional about his words. And it's subversive. It's the first thing that I've experienced from you. Maybe I'm wrong. That's been intentionally subversive, which I just didn't expect. Do you feel that you need to be, like, for example, if you feel that we need to be subversive to our enemies, why, rather than directly confronting GW in like what they were doing, why not like almost tongue-in-cheek participate in their games in like a plausible, deniable kind of way so that you could reap the benefits of the new world order while also being like subversive about it? Is this just a lesson that you've learned after that, or do you get what I'm asking here? I feel like I'm half forming this question, but do you get the question that I'm forming?
I do. And the answer is because it's dishonest.
Gotcha.
Because again, like when I say Mussolini was a socialist, I am fully confident in my assertion there. I don't think there's anything wrong about it. Now, one can certainly quibble the definition about it, like the left might quibble the definition between a Stalinist, a Leninist, a Trotskyist, etc., etc., etc. But when you speak to the common man, you need to talk to them in a way that the common man understands. And in this case, socialist is the largest banner. So it is being subversive in a way, as indeed you are correct. The technical definition would be to call him a fascist. In fact, you could even expand upon that further to break it down, but nobody would then understand.
Fascists
what
are
I'm
never
saying.
anything but a hyphenation, right? It's a crypto-fascist or an extra.
Yes.
Yes, of course, of course. Okay, interesting. So it's dishonest. Like, for example, if you played with GW, you could potentially play with their games of like not saying certain things or not criticizing certain things, but add in tongue-in-cheek criticisms later. But you want to be subversive towards socialists because you're saying like, well, it's like the broader banner. But it's like, well, the broader banner is kind of authoritarianism, right? In like a modern lens. Yeah. We don't need to stay on this. I'm just very surprised by this. I'm very surprised by the subversive stuff. So to go on, you said we all need to be subversive. So that's quite the interesting ought statement. What do you mean by that?
Well, in this case, like the use of the word subversion here is more so a deliberate affection towards the common man, more so rather than, again, a lie. As I want to point that out again. I don't think there's anything incorrect about calling him a socialist, in the same way that you could broadly define all of the problems as with authoritarianism, for example, where we're taking communism, fascism, Nazism, etc., all very different things, under the same banner of this thing bad. Well, one of the things the left did very effectively was to make certain words mean this thing bad. And that is something that our side has begun to pick up on as well, because it is an effective tool in modern day politics. As, again, the majority of people don't know anything about this, don't want to know anything about this. And if you're going to change culture, if you're going to change minds, you do have to play that game, as into the general populace. But there are good ways and bad ways to do it. Doing it in like the infiltrating GW tongue-in-cheek stuff is dishonorable. It's not virtuous. It is the tools of the enemy. It is deconstructing it. Whereas I would much rather go like, no, I actually think your opinions are terrible, and I think they're bad for this, and this reason, and here are my alternatives.
Gotcha. Okay. So, I feel like I'm still not understanding what you mean when you say we all need to be subversive. You obviously don't mean being deceptive. So then what do you mean by subversive?
Well, in this case, it is subverting, I guess, the terminology of the established order, which is, at the moment, the left wing. The left wing has determined what these words mean, which is why, as you say, when you call Mussolini a fascist, what people think is, oh, right wing. That is what I'm subverting. Like, no, not right wing, left wing. So I guess that's the more boiled down point of it.
Okay, gotcha. So this is our description of how you view the world, right? You view the world as kind of this like, as something that's been lost, right? That we're post golden era. And you're somebody who tried to fight for that golden era to remain. You saw you saw the British coming essentially and tried to prevent that thing from happening that you thought would ruin the golden age. And essentially, it sounds like you would also say, and it did. I did not win that war, and it did ruin the thing that was beloved to me, which was 40K. How, and as a response, because I suspect that this is something that developed, this subversion piece specifically probably developed through Gamergate, I would suspect, particularly because, as you said, you were not very politically aware during Gamergate. You were a guy who liked 40K. How do you view other people?
Other people?
Yeah.
How do you mean? Like just in general, like the grand populace, or just other individuals?
Both.
Okay. Well, the grand populace I view as the 98%, as politics is the 2% arguing over the 98, with the moment the 1% being the left and the right in the broadest possible context. The 98%, they liked it in the golden age. They didn't really want to think about politics. They weren't bothering with educating about it. Politics was stuff for other people. And often the idea back then was like, oh, there's somebody really clever who's doing politics. There's a professional politician. I don't need to worry about it. It's laws and stuff. It's relevant.
Okay.
And so these people will usually need to be convinced using terminology they understand. They need to be spoken to directly. I can have a conversation like this with you because I'm fairly sure that you understand the meaning of my words when I use them. I would not speak to a complete random person the same way. I'd probably try to explain things a little bit more or utilize different terms. Like that's where, for example, the socialist comes from, because whereas you understand the difference between a fascist and a Nazi, for example, the average person is like, well, what's the difference between that? So in a denigrating way, I guess I'm calling the average populace stupid, and that's kind of true, but it's less that they're stupid and more that they're disinterested in this. But the problem is, of course, that in a democratic system, you do need a voter base that are interested, that have at least some understanding. And if they don't, our system doesn't work. And as it is right now, it is majoritively thoughts, ideas, left, right, who are trying to convince the majority, which is not ideal, as it would be far better if the majority was debating within itself as to what direction to lean in, rather than being affected by outside forces, external forces, but that's not where we are.
Gotcha.
As for other individuals, I try to be as charitable as I can towards other individuals. I try to be open and honest in conversations with them and assume that they are agreeable individuals. This is a lesson I've learned to be incorrect on many occasions, but I just can't quite shake the habit.
Gotcha. Okay, so at an individual kind of so essentially at an interpersonal level, you give benefit of the doubt, not trust, but benefit of the doubt, and people have to prove you wrong to remove the benefit of the doubt, is what it sounds like.
In large parts, yes.
Okay, it's very interesting. If I asked you these three questions 7 years ago, so as you're starting to pop off, but I think that would still be before all the controversy, maybe not. Essentially, imagine I ask you this question as you're popping off, but before the controversy. You're just kind of making 40K content because you love it. Do you think your answers would have been as political as they were for these questions today?
I was virtually completely politically uninterested when it first started. I just wanted to do 40K.
Gotcha. Had you ever heard of Mussolini or the Great Upheaval or any of these things?
No, I had no idea that there was two forms of fascism, for example, like Nazism and fascism. I certainly didn't know that Hitler was the one copying Mussolini and not the other way around.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. And so do you think it was Gamergate or the controversy? Like what made you feel like, Was it GW getting politicized, or was it just Gamergate that forced politics onto you?
It was largely Gamergate beginning to illuminate the movement that was beginning in larger society that woke me up to it. And I realized then that I didn't like what was beginning to happen in the world. And so I placed myself in opposition to it, in essence.
Gotcha. Okay. Would you say that now, though, politics is pretty ingratiated into your content regularly? You think and talk about it often?
Yes, I do think so. I have become far more politically active, obviously. That's what I'm doing on my alt channel right now, is basically all politics and the culture surrounding it. So, yes.
Gotcha. When you think about the golden day, when like politics was out of it, do you think that that is something that you could recreate? Because you kind of talked about how you like want to create for others kind of this experience. I don't think I wrote down the quote. But you, like, when you got into it, you were interested in kind of creating for others like this world that they could too get kind of lost into. Do you think that you could do that again, or is that lost even for you?
Well, in part, yes, in part, no. Like, I'm currently working on a pair of settings, one science fiction, one fantasy, where we are basing our world on certain things. Like, the fantasy is very Lord of the Rings, very escapism, whereas the science fiction is very philosophical rather than political. Each of the factions is based on a philosophical idea, and that, of course, can be extrapolated into politics, but that's not the intent of it. So I am making efforts to try and return to that time. And if I weren't, then I wouldn't bother doing any of this. But as to whether or not it's possible, I'm not sure. The internet is largely to blame for a lot of this, as the internet allows for the transference of ideas and opinions on a much broader scale and much faster than previously. We've already seen the rise and, in essence, fall of the left wing in record time, from near complete and utter cultural dominance to now having SJW be a curse word, to wokey be a curse word in 10 years. Like, that's unprecedented. Mm-hmm. And I'm now already beginning to see elements of the right wing heading down the same lane as this, where I would not be at all surprised if in a few years' time we have Christian conservatism having risen to the point where it's screaming, ban gaming, ban porn, ban entertainment, just as loudly. At which point the left wing will begin to rise again, like, see, we told you the conservatives were evil, and so along it goes. Mm. I'm not entirely sure if this is a pendulum that can be stopped or even paused anymore.
Gotcha. How do you feel about the, in political philosophy, there's this idea of a snap, right? That if, particularly if democracies trend too far left for too long, there's often a reactionary and sometimes very often historically violent snap, right? Where the culture, the politics, everything snaps really hard, right? Obviously, we're seeing a fairly strong, significant snap right culturally. We're also starting to see it politically with talks in America right now about even potentially gay marriages being taken away. As somebody who is so anti-SJW, how do you feel about seeing, for example, like Laura Loomer and a lot of people just calling for the cancellation of like even just like edgy jokes about the recent assassination, not actual celebrations, but just people like privately making edgy jokes. Like, how do you feel about the snap right?
Well, there's a complicated part right there. So I did a video just today saying that right-wing cancel culture hasn't gone far enough, using Jimmy Kimmel as an example. Because Jimmy Kimmel was canceled for basically saying the shooter was MAGA, and then brought back on again by ABC. He came on, made a sort of pseudo-apology a little bit, like walking back some of the stuff, and then moved on as usual, right? So right-wing cancel culture, which has blown up largely around the Charlie Kirk assassination and has been very effective. The left is shocked by this. Like, holy shit, how did you do that? It has been the only thing in the last, 10 years that has gotten the left at large, and we're not just talking about, the moderate left, but the extreme left, Sasan Pikers, the Destinies of the world, to suddenly be like, free speech is really important and we have to protect it. Like, okay, we agree. And
Well,
That seems to be a lesson.
it's tough because when you say that, I would definitely agree about like the Hassan Pikers and the Voshes, but there's been a pretty significant, loud, large camp of like moderate liberals who have been calling for free speech the whole time. They've been, I think of Slate Star Codex, for example. He tends to trend moderate to left typically, but through all the SJW stuff, he was vehemently opposed to the cancelings. I remember he did a great article on the Lindsay Ellis canceling, which was insane. And he's speaking quite similarly about the right-wing cancellation. He's saying the whole time, like, guys, it's bad when either side does it.
Yes, and I agree. It is bad when either side does it. But for the moment, the one side has been doing it significantly more than the other for a significantly longer period and as an integrated part of their tactics. And having those tactics applied back to them, particularly in such an effective format, appears to have been the first time that a lot of the fringe elements are suddenly going, wow, this is actually bad. Maybe we do need some sort of protections against it. And that is where I would like to be, because I look at the right-wing, like, official government institutions now going, okay, we're looking at hate speech laws in America. I'm like, God, no, that's idiotic. We shouldn't have any of that. But it's also effective. In an ideal world, I want to bring the left to a position where it feels that it is in existential danger, as the right did, so that it too will go, okay, no, free speech needs to be sacrosanct. We need to have a sacred value of it. The problem there, of course, is that sacred value is difficult to enshrine for both parties. As current in England, for example, it's a brilliant example of this, where you have the English flag protests, where suddenly all of the left-wing parties, even Keir Starmer, is waving English flags. They wouldn't have been seen dead with an English flag before this. So it kind of points out that this isn't a value they hold. It isn't something that is sacred to them. It is a political expediency that they are embracing at this particular moment. So I guess I would like for it to be sacred for both of us.
Yeah, I guess if you say that it hasn't gone far enough, though, it feels like if we're back at the match situation where like one side has been holding a lit match close to paper and now the other side's holding a lit match close to the paper and they both just keep getting closer and closer and then pointing at each other and being like, you're really bad for getting your match closer to the paper. And it's like, yeah, but you're both doing it. And it feels like what you're saying is, we need to move a little bit closer to the paper so that they understand how bad it is to move close to the paper. That'll change the future. Has that ever worked out in history?
Well, yes, it has on multiple occasions. Majority of occasions. In fact, escalation from one side is what shut down the other. Very, very rarely has both parties gone, okay, we just got to back down simultaneously. No. Majority of situations, when you have violent change, one side crushes the other. I wouldn't like to see that happen. But at the moment, the left has demonstrated absolutely no interest in backing down. In fact, as Destiny says, we need to turn down the temperature until the right in essence surrenders. The right has been trying to surrender for a very long time. It has taken aboard the majority of the left wing's moral arguments, political arguments. It's been bending over backwards. Now, finally, everyone is going, okay, enough. And that's when you have the snap back, as you mentioned. This is at a moment where if you don't want an escalation, it must be the left that backs down because the right won't. If you're both holding a match to the paper, as you say, but one side is like, no, I'm going to detonate the bomb. I don't give a fuck. Okay, we have two options. Either we detonate the bomb or the side that can still back down backs down. Like, it's not an ideal situation. It's a shit situation. It's an awful situation that it is absolutely one in which you are both escalating, but it also appears to be a reality.
But it's asking for a future that both sides, when they get power, are enacting greater and greater tyranny on the other side.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Forever.
Yep, both sides are escalating.
Well, but the issue is that both sides feel justified, right? When I talk to the left, so what you describe is like, this is why we feel this way. And I'd go like, yeah, that's fair. I understand why the right feels that way. The concern that I have is now you're just going to make the left feel that way? Is that actually because you guys feel that way, it's justifying your guys' tyranny. Won't that just further justify the left's future tyranny?
It will. And vice versa. The left oversteps, the right oversteps. until one side crushes the other. The only exception to this rule is like with nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear weapons have brought in an era of unprecedented peace across the globe because both sides are like, okay, we can't hit this button. We hit this button, everything fucking ends. Everything fucking ends. And that caused a general de-escalation. We're not at that point yet, but we are getting there. And I mean, just today, I believe there was a shooting at an ICE facility. A lot of the right wing is beginning to really begin radicalizing because it was quite slow to radicalize, but it's beginning to radicalize. And the left will probably see that, and it having created this. Oh, see, this is another element of the internet, right? Where you create bubbles. People become insulated in their own groups. And so the left looks at the right and goes, you're clearly attacking us. It's a transgenocide. Don't you understand? And the right goes, you're crazy. You're canceling us. I've personally been cancelled. Shut up. And both sides just continues turning up the temperature. And at the end of the day, I think the right is more justified in doing it at the moment because it has been victimized the longest. I do not believe the moral onus is on the right to back down right now.
I guess it's very tough to hear that because it feels like all of the great stories and theologies and philosophies that the Western democratic system is built upon are stories of rising over justified vengeance and anger. It's stories of the victim or the downtrodden getting a chance for power and like choosing grace and mercy. And so I have a very hard time squaring this because it feels like I can fully understand it at an emotional level. And yet all of our stories are built on saying those emotions are super fair, they're superhuman, and they lead to destruction. And I'm very surprised to hear you embrace that, right? If people in your life had risen over their emotional need and their desire for vengeance and their anger, right? A lot of people of color, I think, especially a lot of women who felt disenfranchised, and understandably so. There's been lots of shitty things that have happened to people of color and to women, right? And I'm sure that you would agree with that. And yet their response to that was to just turn the pain onto others, which led to the situation that you were in. It seems very odd, like we're just never going to learn a lesson to go through that and go, and now we need to dish it out.
Yeah, well, it's one of the problems, of course, is that when you avoid this is unironically when your opposition has already been destroyed. The reason why the liberal world order, the rising above, was romanticized, etc., was because the West dominated the world. A lot of this is British values. When Britain was so big, it could basically force every other country to its knees. When Britain said, no, you don't get to do slavery, and sent the gunboats to slavers' port, they invaded nations. They forced them to end. They threatened them with embargoes. They threatened entire nations with economic disaster because they had the moral right. They had the power to do it. Right now, liberalism is at the, in essence, I believe, end of several hundred years of that dominance. So now we're struggling. Actually, there's a brilliant communist quote on this. This is the time of monsters where new ideas are struggling to be born. And it's kind of true. And you are correct. There isn't a straightforward solution here. Like, it would be really nice to simply say, okay, well, if the right just backs down on this, then the left will follow suit. But will it? And the left as well. Oh, but if we just back out on this, the right will follow suit. Will it? And both sides have good reasons to doubt it. The left has been predating upon the right for a very long time. And even now, as you say, we have people in government, in Trump's administration, going, we're going to do hate speech laws. We have a rising amount of Christian conservatives going, no, maybe we should look at gay marriage. Like, in a situation where both parties have convinced themselves that they are fighting for their own survival, it is very difficult for either party to back down.
I understand that, but I guess what my commentary to that would go, the left and right are fundamentally still unified under the same flag, And the survival should not be the left or the right. The survival should be the United States of America and the dreams and visions that it was built upon. The right should never be so cavalier as to think that they're better than the vision of United States of America, and neither should the left, right? And so I understand what we're saying, but what we're also talking about is destroying the thing that's united. The whole point of the United States is varying groups. The two-party system is built on an assumption that these two groups will constantly be fighting, and that's how balance is found, right? By self-advocating. And so when I'm seeing both sides leaning into, and just to be clear, just before this started, I'm getting a lot of shit from the left because I'm pushing back in the exact same way. So I'm definitely not for, like, your viewers who are unfamiliar with me. This is not the lefty who was calling for cancellation and is now being like, oh, it hurts, don't do it to me. This is the principled liberal saying, I've been saying this the whole time, I'm saying this still. It hasn't made me many friends. And the issue is that it feels as though we act as though the future is certain and linear, because we act like the history is certain and linear. And as you know from studying history, that's certainly not the case. Iran is a great example of a country that if like two things had been different, the whole country would be different now. I mean, it's a Hollywood movie, what happened in Iran. It's uncanny, truly. And I get very fearful when we talk about this because we use this as like some sort of like linear prediction of game theory. But democracy was built on a hope of something better. It was built on a belief of defying the fear that we have of each other's human nature.
That is correct. But then we also need to look at what this means, right? Because democracy, especially in America, was built on a great deal of gentlemen's agreements. For example, we didn't have term limits until after the Second World War, because it was understood that in certain situations of extreme need, you might not want to replace the president, like, I don't know, in the middle of a world war, for example, just because he'd been serving for 8 years. Right. But then, of course, Roosevelt massively abused that and decided to hold on to power in a situation where he knew, everyone around him knew that he was not capable of actually carrying out the responsibilities of the president. And so the Republicans went like, okay, fine, I guess we have term limits now. And the history of gentlemen's agreements in America is a fascinating one, as one after another has been broken down. Usually because one side does something, the other side responds, then it feels justified in breaking the next gentleman's agreement, and so on and so on. And none of these agreements have been rebuilt. That's the problem. Once trust is lost, it seems extraordinarily difficult to regain it.
Absolutely.
And especially when you have a situation like America is in right now as well, America does need to be united. China is not playing around. China wishes to be the next hegemon. It is already becoming the cultural hegemon. It is beating America in video games and entertainment very soon, and it is building a military with everything it's got. China wishes to defeat the United States, whether that be in a political sense, preferably, because it cannot beat it militarily, but it is an active opponent. And a weakened America is, of course, exactly what it wants. But simultaneously, even if you understand that, it's very difficult to then point to both parties and go, okay, we've got to unify now, because the right will look at the left and go like, yeah, but he hates me. And the left will look at the right and go like, no, but he hates me. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where we are right now. There's no unity with people who hate you.
I just think that the miracles of history happened when people believed in that anyways. And if enough people get together and all agree to believe in that, despite the fact that it is hard and unlikely, that's when miracles of free speech, that's when miracles of freedom of association, like all of the miracles that we honestly take for granted, get created. And yeah, I'm curious if you would have felt this way before you got fucked over by GW and the Warhammer community and the Gamergate community, I suppose.
Oh, no, definitely not. For the majority of my time, I've been very idealistic, just like yourself. I've considered myself very center, very liberal for the majority of my time. But I believe I've grown more realistic. Like,
just to be
looking
clear,
at the situation we're in.
Just respectfully, I actually don't super appreciate being called idealistic. just because it sounds naive. And
I believe you are. Like,
I've been
I
chased
believe
by
in the
kids with
idea you just
axes.
described.
I've held the hands of people as they die. I have had to restrain children as they are trying to stab my eye out. I have had to love kids who have raped other children. I'm not idealistic. It's a tactical necessity.
Okay, but is it going to work? Like, do you think it's a realistic possibility?
Not unless a whole lot of people start to agree with me.
Exactly. And that's why I would again argue that is a naive position to be in. Like, I don't think humanity
if I convince
thinks
you,
like
if I
this.
convince the next person, if I convince the next person, it's not naive. It's hard, right? It is hard. I'm not pretending it's not hard, but like, do you know the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once?
I do not.
Oh, really? It's great. You might like, I don't know what type of movies you like. But at the end, Waymond, he's like the protagonist's lover, husband. He says, "You always thought that I was naive for my optimism, but it's not. It's a tactical necessity. I understand people being vengeful and angry. I understand you being vengeful and angry. When I went through the stuff that you had said, some of it I'm like, I disagree. I don't know if I'd stand on business on some of those things, but I don't think it's worth like destroying somebody's career over. My understanding is you were very poorly treated. And I get that. Just recently, I was banned on YouTube, and the stress of the ban and the harassment that I've received, mostly from the left wing, it actually resulted in me miscarrying. So
I'm so sorry.
thanks. It's okay. So I'm not naive at all. I promise. I just think there is a tactical necessity for goodness, because that's what built this miracle that we live in right now. And I think it is under threat. And I think you're right from both sides. I don't think that this is a single-sided issue.
Okay. I'll check out the movie, by the way. I'll do that.
Yeah. It's very silly, but it's very good too. So hopefully you like absurdism.
I'll watch it. Because, again, in my position, I don't think there's another option at the moment. From what I've seen from history, and I have studied history most of my life, I find it incredibly intriguing. The moments of genuine unity in the face of adversity are rare, and usually comes from shared values. And I am not convinced we share those values anymore.
We might not, but I guess I hope to fight to find those shared values.
And that is an admirable position to hold.
Yeah. I mean, I think we share some values, right? Like you, despite, I suspect, being backstabbed by a lot of people. We haven't gotten into it, but I suspect that that's occurred a lot. When you meet a new person, you give them the benefit of the doubt, which is all logic, all history, all of your history would actually tell you that that's a foolish thing to do.
Majoritively, yes. But hey, I have met some decent people on the internet too, so it's not all bad.
I agree. Yeah. I guess I'm curious, despite your history telling you that you shouldn't give people the benefit of the doubt, why do you?
Because it's the proper thing to do.
Yeah. I agree. I commend you for it. I think it's really good. I mean, I think the fact that you were willing to take this interview, despite knowing the political space that I inhabit, I think is you giving me the benefit of the doubt, which I really, really appreciate. Even though it took 2 years.
It did. Yes. I have never stopped talking to people. Like, that's one of my values. I've always taken conversations with anyone, even when I know it was going to be very antagonistic. I've always done that, and I intend to continue to do so.
Gotcha. Is there something about you I haven't asked that I should?
No, I'm a pretty boring person, honestly.
That's not what I found in this conversation, frankly. What is... I know that. Okay, you like Greek philosophy a lot. What is your favorite era of history?
The World Wars, definitely.
Why?
Mostly because of the intersectionality of politics with military. Because if I was going to go purely military, I would say pike and shot. Because the pike and shot era was the period of history in which the single largest amount of military innovations were created. Even more so than World War II. It is the era where we started fighting in pre-made formations, so pike and shot with the pikemen and the gunners. We didn't used to do that. That was a rediscovery of Roman military and Greek tactics manuals that made people think, oh, we don't just need to run at each other in blocks of peasants? Let's try that. And it created a lot of military innovation, but it was near exclusively military. The largest political disagreement at the time was what they called God, basically. Like, no, I'm a Protestant. No, I'm a Catholic. It was even the same God, just arguing over how to worship him. Whereas World War I to II, you had... See, there's an interesting parallel here with our situation politically and World War I. So, do you know why World War I was inevitable?
No, but I know that it's in therapy we would call the killing of Franz like the orange. Like, it's not about the killing of Franz. There's no way the killing of Franz is significant enough to cause a global eruption. But my understanding is there was lots of boundary turf wars going on between all of the European countries.
Sort of. Like, there were a lot of territorial disputes and stuff like that, and alliances, obviously. But what made it inevitable was mobilization. See, in wars previously, specifically in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-something, it became clear that we could mobilize millions of people. Industrial society had allowed us to build huge populations and huge militaries. The question then was, how do we get all of these men in the field? And the theory was that if Germany could put 3 million men in the field and France won, Germany wins. And if Germany could do this in a week, then the war was over immediately. And that was the part of World War I. Each of the countries had these enormously complex logistical plans to mobilize millions of men, to arm them, uniform them, give them artillery, and send them crashing over the enemy's borders. So when Austria started mobilizing a part, Russia went, okay, shit, I could lose, I need to mobilize. They started mobilizing. The Germans were like, holy fuck, we're going to get overrun, we need to mobilize. Then the French are like, okay, we're going to lose, we need to mobilize. The moment the first mobilization order was out, both parties had their hands, their paper, to the powder keg, and there was no stopping it.
Interesting. I didn't know that, actually, about World War I. Do you have time? I know I've kept you for 2 hours straight already. If I open up, so if I say to people, if you would like to send in a super chat to ask Arch a question, I will vet them if you send in just insults. I'll take your money, but I'm not reading your super chat. But if you guys have like genuine questions for Arch, anything about his past, anything that's happened, send in your super chats. It won't pop up on screen because it's annoying, but I will read it. I do have that open. Okay, so your favorite section. I feel like that's how you know that you're an actual history guy, because if you ask most people about their favorite history section, they just say like the Romans or whatever, like they just do the meme. Whereas if you're actually a military person, you're gonna have some like specific kind of esoteric. I don't know if I've ever met anyone other than my dad who it's the world wars that he's like most obsessed with. Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so mobilization basically made that. And was the technology of the vehicle a large portion of that mobilization is because of the speed of that mobilization as well?
The train. Because we didn't really have that many trucks yet. Like, trucks were not a major part of military infrastructure, other than for moving artillery. That often used trucks, but even then it was often horses. But the train. And the American Civil War was a big part of this, where a lot of European observers looked at the North and the South moving troops by train and went, we could do that, but on a much larger scale. Because a train, especially Germany, worked out dozens of mobilization plans where they used thousands of trains, and they timed it down to like the minute, where one train would pass the other on the track, then switch over so that they could get the maximum number of troops to the front. These were hyper-complex equations, basically. And the train allowed them to move these huge numbers of troops, along with their food and ammunition, to the front in a day or two. Which is, again, why all of the nations were so afraid, because if 1 million guys walk over your border, what do you do?
Okay. So there was just a lot of Tylenol Americans that were organizing those train systems, is what you're telling me.
Yes, the plans were ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it required thousands of people to work on this, as they needed, like, I think Germany alone had like miles and miles, hundreds upon hundreds of miles of railway, and all of it need to be used perfectly. Because if one train stops, everything stops.
Yes. Yeah. There's this interesting, have you ever seen like there'll be like visual diagrams of the flow of traffic that like, yeah, I had never thought about that before, about how like if you're bumper to bumper, that means you have to stop if any car stops ahead, and that actually like disrupts it all, which is why it's actually super important to have like one car space, because if there's one car space, you actually just will always move faster, which was good for me to learn, because I was a freak when I drove in the past. I liked being bumper to bumper. What's your opinion of the emu war?
Australians have always been really bad at warfare, by and large.
Interesting. I wonder why.
It's the magic soil. They went to a place where the indigenous population had never invented anything but a boomerang, and they've clearly been affected.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. All right. I don't think we've gotten too many super chats in. Just a mean one that I'm not going to read. So, somebody wants to know about your taste in women.
The crazier, the better.
Gotcha. Okay. Yep. Amazing. Arch, I appreciate you taking so much time. Is there anything, where can people find you? Anything you'd like to last shout out? Anything like that?
I'm on YouTube. Archcast is the channel where I talk about political stuff, and just simply Arch is where I still cover Warhammer Fantasy and Warhammer 40,000.
Gotcha. Final question. Have you ever looked into Latin American history?
Yes, more so recently. I've always been fascinated by the major empires, the Aztecs and the Mayans, for example, and their interactions often preceding the conquistadors as well, as these were very intriguing empires, as they were created often in violation of the usual laws of empire building. From what we know how empires are created, for example, the Mayans should not have been able to do what they did. They reached a level of civilization far beyond what they should do and what we see in most of the rest of the world, which is really fascinating.
Okay. Thank you for doing this. Johnny also says thank you for doing this for $5. I appreciate it. Yeah, if you ever want to chat again about politics more specifically, I'd be happy to chat again. And if I don't, it was nice talking to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for being on. Have a good one.
Thank you.